Example 5 says, suppose the null hypothesis is Frank's rock climbing equipment is safe. We need to state the type 1 and type 2 errors. The type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually true. So the type 1 error would be that Frank's equipment is not safe if we're rejecting the null hypothesis. It's the opposite of the null hypothesis. So Frank's equipment is not safe when in fact it actually is safe. All right, the type 2, if we look up here, is when we don't reject the null hypothesis. So we say that Frank's equipment is safe, but that's actually false. Okay, the null hypothesis is actually false. So we think that, or Frank thinks, right? So Frank thinks his equipment is safe when in fact it is not safe. So something that we look at in some of the other examples is which error has the greater consequence. And just to get you to start thinking about that, if you take a look at these, the first one is Frank's equipment is not safe, but it actually is, or Frank thinks his equipment is safe when in fact it's not safe. So in this case, the type 2 error would have the greater consequence. Example 6. It's a Boy Genetic Labs claim to be able to increase the likelihood that a pregnancy will result in a boy being born. Statisticians want to test the claim. Suppose that the null hypothesis is It's a Boy Genetic Labs has no effect on gender outcome. Now we need to figure out the type 1 and the type 2 errors. So the type 1 error says that we reject the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is that it has no effect on gender outcome. If we reject it, it's the opposite. So It's a Boy Genetic Labs has an effect on gender outcome when in fact it does not. So we reject the null hypothesis, whatever the opposite of the null hypothesis is, but the null hypothesis is actually true. So that's the type 1 error. All right, the type 2 here is that we do not reject the null hypothesis. So the It's a Boy Genetic Labs has no effect on gender outcome when in fact that's false, when in fact they do. So if we wanted to know which is the error of greater consequence, it would be the type 1, because couples are thinking that this lab does have an effect on the outcome. They're paying their money, but in fact they don't. Looks like I've duplicated 2 examples here. So this one, It's a Boy Genetic Labs, that is actually example 7. And I'll put example 6 here. All right, you'll have to excuse me. So example 6 is that the null hypothesis states that the victim of an automobile accident is alive when they arrive at the ER. And so we are trying to find the type 1 and the type 2 errors. So the type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis. So the ER thinks the Vic is not alive, let's put dead, but in fact the null hypothesis is true when in fact he is alive. That's the type 1. So the type 2 error would be when we think that the null hypothesis is true, so we don't reject it. So the ER thinks the victim is alive, but in fact the null hypothesis is false, when in fact he is dead. So when we think about the error of greater consequence here, it's definitely the type 1, Because if the ER thinks that he's dead when he's in fact alive, that's a huge issue. So that is example number 6. And last, number 8, a certain experimental drug claims a cure rate of at least 75% for males with prostate cancer. Describe both the type 1 and the type 2 errors in context. So first, let's figure out our null hypothesis and our alternative. So we'll start by doing the original claim. Remember, we did this in a previous video. It says that the cure rate is at least 75%, so greater than or equal to 75%. So then the competing claim is that it's less than 75%. So our null hypothesis is that the cure rate is at least 75%, so greater than or equal to 75%. Now we can do the type 1 error. So the type 1 error, if you remember, we look here. Our type 1 error is where we reject the null hypothesis. So we say that the experimental drug does not have a cure rate of at least 75%. So let's say we believe cure rate is less than 75%, when in fact it is at least 75%. Then we do the type 2 error, which is where we don't reject it. So we think that the null hypothesis is true, but actually it's false. So we believe the cure rate is at least 75% when in fact it is less than 75%. And which one of these, it says which error is the more serious? The type 2 error is the more serious in this case. Because if we believe that something has a cure rate of at least 75% and it actually doesn't, that has a greater consequence than the other error.